Hello everyone and welcome to this new episode of Pacific Toks Season 2. I'm your host Philipe, and in this podcast I engage in active conversations with my guests to talk about global challenges through a Pacific perspective. Today I'm very happy to introduce my guest for this episode. For once, it's someone from my home island who's coming to share a conversation with me, someone I've known for years and with whom I had the chance to collaborate many times, Alexander Lee. Alexander is an artist from Tahiti who has traveled all around the world to express his art through many forms around the idea of perspective and connections with others. With him, we talk about his creative process, the need for art and contemporary art especially, in questioning our island societies in the wake of our history, and how art can guide us into the future. So now, on to my conversation with Alexander. Alex, Ora Na,
Ora Na.
welcome to the Pacific Talks. I'm very happy to have you in our studio today and have this conversation with you. Privileged to have known you for some years and following your art. So I'm very happy to have the chance to have this discussion with you. So welcome today.
Thank you, Maruro, for this invitation, Philippe.
So for people who don't know you yet, there are some like that. For the moment, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, about your life path, and maybe a little bit also about your art philosophy?
So Alexander Lee, I've basically I grew up in Tahiti. I had the chance to be born in the U.S., or not, maybe not the chance, the unfortunate event. But basically, I'm Polynesian from 3 generations, and I grew up here, and then I went back to the U.S. to study for college, to art school. And I now have a practice between Tahiti, back home where my parents are, my extended family, and my culture, and also the rest of the world. So I'm fortunate enough to have this global practice where I can be in different places in the world, and it helps me think about the world differently and think about each place not from its locality when I'm there, but then also from the perspective of the other place where I'm not, or where I am in relationship to the other place that I left or that I'm going to. So my art practice. So I've materially, I guess I'm very interested in materials and making things with my hands. So I've always made drawings, and then from there started to make sculptures and paintings. But I also know how to use a computer, so I also know how to use digital tools to make videos and film. And in terms of the artistic project, if I can say it that way, I think it's my background is very unique because I feel like coming from 5 different cultures and perspective, Hakka Chinese, French, American, Polynesian, queer, and everything that goes in between. I feel like all of these people or cultures and facets of myself give me a stance to look at the other ones. And so in respect to the artistic project and the world, I think it's really interesting for me to, at this moment especially, to be able to have a voice in thinking about the world from all of those perspectives, and also think about the different alternatives. So instead of being Eurocentric or American-centric or Western-centric, I can say, well, actually, I'm also Asian and Polynesian, and I can think in reverses. And if we want to talk about future studies and ways to look at, prospectivists and ways to look at the futures, to look at inverses and alternatives.
And do you think, unlike maybe other local artists from Tahiti or from the Pacific, this diversity of yours really shapes the way that you understand or that you live your art? Like, I mean, you said you use like different materials, you're very easy on different types of arts, you have different perspectives. So is it because of your multicultural background that you have developed this easiness in production or in creativity?
Nothing's easy when you're an artist.
Or this ability, if not easiness, then.
I think things take time. And so obviously my brothers are not artists. They're from the same mold maybe than me in a way you can say, you know. And, so I don't think necessarily the environment helps, but it's also a personal impetus, right? To decide to want to be an artist and to make it in a life goal or career path or whatever you want to call it. But I think it certainly informs my practice and my vision of the world. And but not everybody also wants to tackle all of these issues all at the same time, right? Somebody could just want to be American artists, even though they might be Hawaiian or Polynesian as well, or vice versa.
Yeah, it adds complexity, obviously, to the way you see things or understand them.
Yeah. Well, I think I realized throughout art school at some point that I was taught the history of art and an art practice on a Western model. And throughout this schooling or throughout this formation, throughout this training, the questions that I've always asked myself is, well, what about the other part? And the other part could be, what about the non-white part? Or what about the non-Western sort of way of looking at it? Or what about, in verses, what about the queer part, if I'm a male? What about the woman's part? What about, and all of that. So I think this questioning is important in trying to think about perspectives, but then also when you look at a completed, quote unquote, like a work of art at the end, the question is also, what does it represent, and where is it coming from, and do I have the clues to understand what it is? I mean, imagine, for me, I always feel like a work is finished when it's at the same time familiar, but then also completely other and foreign, right? So it's like a UFO, but it's also not. But it's enough that you're like
a familiar UFO.
There's something, there's something that is kind of quite not right, or there's something that is either makes it a better version of what you recognize, or a completely strange and ask you questions about why do you think that way, right? Why do you not like this color combination, or why does it vibrate in your eyes so that even if you don't like the color combination, you can't stop looking at it like a UFO or like a car crash, because it triggers something in you, either optically with color or emotionally, or all of it, right? Like form, color, context, the way you apprehend the work, like you come upon something or you expect something, and all of a sudden you're in a place that you don't expect to be, or an environment, or that even just color can do very tricky and emotional things to you, right? From afar you can look at something and just feel like, oh my god, too busy, tacky, whatever, like shiny. And then you come closer and something happens that makes you stop and think, there's something strange and weird, and I don't quite understand what it is, but it makes me stop and I want to look at it and question it and either live with it, or at least it triggers you in different ways, so that hopefully you ask yourself questions.
And this ability to see the other perspective, as you say, like whatever side you are on, to see the other side, is it what helped you also to have this international exposure? You've exposed your art in South America and the US and Europe, in many, many places way outside the Pacific. So is it because of that ability of yours to adapt to the other that you managed to interact more easily with very different audiences? And how can you find a way to interest people to Polynesian art, if that's what maybe you define your art?
Oh, there's so many questions into that comment. Where do I start? I think as an artist, first, one should s'alimenter. One should feed oneself, right? So some people could be perfectly happy just working in their studio and not seeing the rest of the world, right? And just sort of like ship things across the world. And that's a way of practicing work. I tend to want to meet the people and go places. And so I have to say I've had the privilege to be invited to different places, but then also I've cultivated relationships so that I have a curiosity, and people are willing to invite me, and sometimes when there's not a lot of budget or whatever, you just sort of make do because you feel like, well, I want to go to Brazil and I want to check out, I don't know, the Carnival or whatever, São Paulo or Rio or whatever. And yeah, or, I don't know, somebody asked me to do a project in Lithuania. And, you're like, what? Like Polynesia to Lithuania?
Yeah, that's
like
unexpected.
And again, I'm not like I don't flip burgers, I'm the kind of artist who doesn't like to make the same work everywhere in the world. And so I always go and ask myself these questions, like, what am I doing here? What is my purpose? And what can I do in a way in this particular context as an artist, in the work, in a place, in the way I meet people, and how do I make these bridges of thematics and human, relationships, but also historical ones, right? So
you don't send your arts there and visit the place. You go there and you create your art from there, bringing with you all your background, all your experience, all your culture.
Well, try
mix it
to
with the feeling of the place, right?
I don't. Okay. It's a way of hopefully not exactly the way you say it, but the idea is to have a discussion, a dialogue with the place, so that and I think it's more respectful. I think maybe it's a cultural thing, right? You go to places, and like in Tahiti, there's a lot of resentment with first contact and colonization, and so there's always this very strong sometimes feelings of, well, it comes from somewhere else, it's not from our place, and what does it do here? Like, it doesn't belong here, it's not part of us. And so even that can be hermetic, this relationship to the other. But then on the other hand, the reverse question arises where it's like, well, when we go to another place, do we make those connections to have a relationship with the other people and not just go and take and leave, right? We're not, because that's always the reproach, like that, this feeling of just being a tourist. You go a place somewhere, and you take and you use and you leave, right? You deplete you or whatever, and then you leave. And so that culture of taking could be an interesting concept to think about. Well, maybe we should stop taking. Maybe we should start to give back and make bridges as opposed to just taking and leaving.
And how does the audience react then when you go there? You create this dialogue between you and everything you bring with you, and the place where you're in. What's the audience reaction? Are they used to that, or is it like something new, or does it create like completely new experience every time?
I think it depends on the project, right? So if it's in a contemporary art center, for example, in Lithuania, I had to do a gigantic mural that was 6 meters high by 40 meters long, and I had 2 weeks to do it. And because they flew me over there, so and I didn't have a lot of time to do it, but then I also had a limited amount of people to have these dialogues with, right? So at least maybe I should say but you talk to people. So I talked to my assistants, whoever was helping me there. I talked to the curators who invited me, and I walk on the street and I look at what's going on, and based on that I compose something. But I also do research ahead of time. Obviously, I don't just like drop in and kind of. There's always discussion about what is the project, what is the thematic of the exhibition, what does it mean, why haven't been selected to be part of the exhibition, and what does the work need to be, and so all of this influences the work, and obviously people call me because they've seen my work before and they know what I'm doing, and so there's usually already a thematical or interest in the way of working.
There's a facilitation for the dialogue, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like if you want, vinegar, you're not gonna buy, I don't know, sugar, right, or something. I mean, so I think that's a little bit of part of the relationship with the place. People invite me because they've seen my work or they understand my process, and they're interested in, giving it a different context, and not just sort of like helping me realize the work, but then also in the process of what does a Polynesian artist who can come from a place of the sea do in the middle of Europe, in a specific context, right?
So you were saying just before that in Polynesia there is some resentment with everything that comes from outside, and this difficulty to eventually make contact and to give also, and not just to take. And obviously the history of French Polynesia has had its own struggle, colonization being the first one, the nuclear era being a major one in terms of consequences. So you're a product of this history. Your diversity is the fact of this historical situation in French Polynesia. So how much do you think this influenced your creativity, and more generally the creativity of the local art scene in Tahiti? Do you think like people really feed themselves from this history and try to question it today, or is it just something they live with and just find other inspiration? Like what's your take on the influence of that?
Okay, so all of our histories are complex, obviously. So, but what's interesting in this history of colonization and the way even the Chinese were brought in afterwards, part of this history, is that it makes us who we are, like you said, but we can't really go back, right? I mean, we all part of the product of these, and so whether we use it to try to understand what happened, but then also try to go forward in developing a place that encompasses all of these histories, or whether we decide to pick a camp and then use the finger pointing to sort of like make a demarcation line is a whole other. It's a personal choice, I guess, and a political one too, obviously. I mean, one can't, but I feel like personally I might not want to just spend the rest of my life just pointing the finger at someone and say, tell my parents it's your fault if I'm the way I am, right? I mean, I'd rather compose with that and move forward, because it is a richness too, right? They made me who I am, the way it is, and they gave me certain tools or not, and if they didn't give me any tools, it's for me to find them and shape them, right? And become who I want to become, and not stay a pariah because I wasn't born white, or I wasn't born rich, or I wasn't born, I don't know, a girl, or I wasn't born man, or whatnot, right? And so I think there's also a very, I mean, I'm not saying everyone's like against the outsiders. I think it's it could be another cliche, but in this era of I feel like we're at an interesting moment because we're in a different shift, in the 21st century, and and it's hard. I mean, we see it around the world where radical right-wing nationalist rhetoric is starting to take a lot of hold and grasp onto people, and I think it's because people are afraid of their future. Right? We're at a moment where, well, this fear of the environmental catastrophe that's been brewing since early 2000 with Al Gore and that movie, and, you know, that made us aware of our environment and what we did to it, also really also put a lot of fear into just thinking about the future, for one. And on the other hand, you have a lot of industrialists who say, well, we could use that fear and sell new cars or new, I don't know, solar panels or guns or whatever, right? Or we could use this fear to make people intolerable of the other and other ways of living and being and thinking and believing in God or religion or even modes of life, right? I mean, we see it in the U.S. and abortion, for example. So, what was I trying to say with all of this? Oh, it's always a personal choice, right? Do you stay? Do you go? Do you stay in one place? Do you go? Do you try to make it better? Do you just complain that it's not like the other place? Or do you, put the fault on the other because it's easy to say, you're different, so it's your fault.
Yeah.
Or you're a woman, so you don't know less, or you're a man, or whatever, right?
And so is it a conscious choice for you to have chosen contemporary art forms of expression in a way to say, I'm not questioning the past, I'm questioning the future? Or is it something that just came to you as a result of your personal experiences?
I think it came from finding my... It's like you don't... I mean, I grew up not knowing what contemporary art meant, right? I grew up not knowing what an artist meant because all of the models of artists were actually... we call them wash ashores. It's like white people arrive on the island and they pretend that they're Gauguin because that's the myth and the cliche that they want to live.
Right. The exotic painter.
Right.
Also, yeah.
Who makes kind of like these like seashell pictures of flowers and naked women, right? And people keep making images like that, and they think it's art, and and that's a whole other. I think it's a question you should ask me, but I don't think that's my practice, and I don't think it interests me to regurgitate cliches that way for commercial purposes. I'm more interested in questioning the world through my art practice, and that means maybe having a pass on saying things, but then also not necessarily having to be politicized in the sense that I have to choose a camp and stick by it because I took a card in a party, whatever it is, right? So, c'était quoi la question? Pardon.
It was about was it a personal choice of yours, the medium that you use?
Contemporary art.
Yeah.
So, well, the thing about being a generalist is that it's nice because you don't necessarily need to be a specialist in all of the fields in order to have a practice, right? You can have a sense of what each things are, and hopefully you can compose with everything and make it into something else. And when you need a specific something, then you either call on your specialist and you try to decipher what that is, right? And then you can sort of like zoom in and out. And and that's kind of how I felt like being an artist in the contemporary field made me more free in a lot of different ways because I could say things, but then I could also liberate myself from them.
we say that you are mostly flexible for the question that comes in your mind to express your answers. Is that a good way to explain it? That what's central to your work is the question or the interaction that you're focusing on, and then from that you end up with a form of art.
I don't know how to say. I don't know if I want to generalize it too much either, because obviously I am a human person and I do need to have desires, and in order to wake up and do what I want to do and make what I want to make. And so if I had to describe my practice, I would say that it always comes from an intuition, and then I try to respond to that intuition by making something, and then to see where that takes me, and I have to say sometimes I don't understand the intuition and I don't understand what I'm doing. It's just that I have this thing, I have a feeling that I need to try to do something interests me. And for some reason, either the context or where I am makes me want to develop that further. It's a little bit like bricolage sometimes. Like you have all these like garage full of, personal projects you want to do, and then depending on the time and the desire, you're like, well, I'm going to work on this now, right? But obviously you start, but you never know where it ends, right? Because it's not a finite process. It's a life project. So you start something, and either it becomes something else, or, it keeps growing so that it becomes, and it develops into something that's, more fully, a sentence that is more fully developed, if I can call it that way. Or it ends because it was a test and it worked, and you're like, well, we don't have enough money, or I don't have the right exhibition, or, not at that place yet, so I'm going to put it aside and I'll come back to it later. Or it could be that, say, I see an image or I see something that interests me and I want to put into an image, and you like the image, but you don't understand what it means. And that answer might not come until like 2 or 3 years later, until something else develops and you're like, oh, I've heard about that story, or I just discovered, right? You just that happened to me. I had an image of this umete that was floating on the ocean, and I that started because somebody gave me an old umete that my neighbor, and she said I used to make ra'au in it, medication, like traditional medication in it, and so it was just. So, her daughter-in-law was going to throw it away, and I saw that outside, and I thought, oh, can I have it, because it means something to me, there's something in there. And she said, yeah, of course you can have it, I want you to have it. So I had it at home, and then I saw that, for example, it started to have termite holes in it. So I asked a friend, oh, how do I treat it against termite without putting pesticides on it? And he said, well, you can either put it in the freezer, but where do you find a freezer that's large enough for a large umete? Or you can also just bathe it in salt water in the sea, and then once in a while, just to like. So I did that. I went to the sea with it, and you put a piece of wood that's carved into the ocean, and it floats, right? So in order for it to get imbibed by the salt in the sea, I had to sort of like almost play with it and keep it under the ocean. I didn't want to leave it in the sea, obviously, overnight or anything. And just this image of this floating bark was beautiful, but I didn't really understand what it was and what it meant. And 2 years later, I was doing research for another project, and I stumbled upon the story of Vaita, who's you might have heard of it, or should I recall it?
Maybe you can, for the listeners who may not be familiar with it.
So Vaita, so it basically goes back to the times of immemorial times, when they had the last Haupau Nui, which is a big gathering of Polynesian priests, I guess you can call them, in Tapuatea, Reatea. and they were all assembled there. And the story goes that there was a wind, a really strong wind that clipped all of the leaves from the tamanu tree on the mare side. And of course, all being priests and men of science, they all wondered what it meant, right? How could a wind like this just clip all the leaves of a tree just like that? And nobody could answer because they were all befuddled by this event. And one of the priests named Vaita stood up and said, "Oh, I know what it means. It means that..." I don't know, I can't say the phrase in Tahitian, but it means like the people from the same tumu than us, people from the same trunk, tree, or the same sush than us would come. They would be different, but they're from the same trunk. And they would totally revolutionize our life. And everything, the entire society would change. And that was such a shock to everyone that, of course, they asked him where he came from and if he could prove that. And of course, like, imagine priests at the time were also like politicians, right? They had the knowledge of
both hats,
right? They were supposed to have the knowledge of divinity, right? And predict things and understand signs when they happen. So if they didn't know what happened in something so big, they were very frightened by their position, right? So Vaita gets called by Tamatoa, the king, the next day, and to repeat what he said. And he gets there, and there's a gigantic audience, and he repeats what he says. And the king asks him, "Well, can you try..." Oh, he further says these people from the same trunk than us would come on big boats with an outrigger, and that was the second outrage because everybody thought that a boat had to come with an outrigger, otherwise it would, sink and just like turn over into the sea. And so they asked him if he could prove that such a boat could exist, and he asked one of the servants of the king to take a umete and put it in the water, and a bowl like floats on the sea without an outrigger. And that was that image that I had made, or that I had thought about 2-3 years before, that I had filmed, but I didn't know what to do with it because I didn't understand what it meant. And so it became a video that I actually made with futurists from Belgium, because I was doing a project about future studies at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Antwerp.
Nice.
It's very cool.
Fascinating to see how the process came in your mind and kind of like be in your head, because sometimes so hard to imagine how artists can work when you're not an artist, right? Okay, I'm gonna...
But I mean, that said, though, I don't know if people get it all, right? I mean, I make things, and for me, it makes sense, and I try to make it in a way that is at the same time interesting and alluring, but it is another way of recodifying all of that process. And so the question, of course, is always, well, do people who come and see the work understand fully everything about it?
But what if they understand something different? Is it bad, or is it also the purpose of art to get something out of it, whatever you get it, because you bring your own experience also from it?
Well, hopefully they're gonna be enchanted, maybe, hopefully, by it, or that it's gonna trigger something by in that they would go further and try to ask them these other questions, right?
Yeah.
I mean, throughout the history of art, artists have always sort of had inside joke stories or narratives embedded into works.
That's true.
And so whether we understand them at the time, or whether we understand them later, or whether they die with that secret, or that those keys is also part of the practice.
Okay, I'm going to ask you the question because you told me to. But so you said that you grew up without an image of an artist, because all the artists at the time were not people like you, we can say, in a shortened way. And indeed, for a long time in Polynesian, French Polynesia, and probably in the Pacific as a whole, the artists, at least those who were known by the audience, were mostly from European American descent. It seems to me that things are changing for now. We see more and more local artists, Polynesian or mixed origins, taking over the art scene and with strong expressions, strong pieces of art are really, really not only beautiful but really questioning things. And we've seen like many exhibitions recently. You've been part of some. You've probably have many artists that you know that are. Do you share this vision that the art scene is shifting in Tahiti and in the Pacific, and that it may be a sign that there are more will from the people here to express themselves and to say this is how we see the world, and we don't want to be seen through the eyes of someone else. We're happy to share, we're happy to connect, like you said, as you do, but we also want our voices to be heard, and we're going to say things the way we want, even if it's through not only traditional arts but a lot of contemporary or like the art scene, like the graffiti scene, for example, like street art and all that. So what's your take on that?
I think we've always had creative people here, whether we call them artists or artisans or tapa makers or vivo sculptors, instrument singers or instrument players. And so we've always have people doing thinking creatively and having sensitivity. I think the question was always like, how do you connect people within localities, right? So you can have someone who's talented in the Marquesas or the Tuamotu, and if they don't come to Tahiti and they don't get play on the radio station, you don't even hear about them, right? It's only when you travel somewhere and then you might go to a brang, like a family sort of like feast that you can hear someone sing. But now that we have digital tools and social media, you could be in your living room singing a song or doing a repeat of something, and you could have an audience. And your audience doesn't necessarily have to be your own in your own locality. They can actually be on the other side of the world. And so I think that's a huge game changer in so many different ways of being aware of the world, so that you can stay in your locality but then also have a relationship to the world, and vice versa. Someone from the other side of the world can be thinking, well, is there I don't want to say the name of the social media company, but is there someone over there who's doing something, and that could be funny or interesting, right? Whether it's music, singing, or arts, right? And so whether it's arts and crafts or tapa making or contemporary or graffiti or at the end of the day the impetus is also to communicate and to try to share something. So hopefully that helps. That sure helps.
So is it that the message is more heard now because technology helps, or do you think also the message that is conveyed by artists have changed recently?
No, I think there's awareness in the Western world too that, well, actually the world is not just white, I'm sorry to say, right? And not just American or European centric. I mean, there are other cultures, and they're worth what they're worth. And they also have practices and creative practices and things that we're interested in, and also marketable, because I have to say, I mean, we've never talked about it, but money and making a market and making something that could be sellable for some kind of reason is also part of the impetus of the world too, right? We wouldn't be going into space if somebody didn't think that they could make money sending satellites up there, and for example. So I think the drive forward, if we can call it that way, is also that there's a market because there might be entertainment value into something, but then also there's another awareness of the world, right? In this relationship to the environment, I hope that one also questions their own relationship to the world, not only just being an urbanite and throwing everything in the trash bin and just call it a day, but also thinking, well, after 2 years of being locked down by COVID, actually, what am I doing in a box in the middle of a city, right? And the relationship to the other and the other world that is, I don't want to say natural, but yeah, I mean, where there's the sea, when there's mountain, when there's nature, is a way to expand one's consciousness of the world. And the question in this moment of our environmental awareness, hopefully, is also awareness of other cultures and how they've survived in other climates and other environments. Right? So this idea of being aware of the ocean as a place and not just the continent as a place, I think for me is very important, because I mean, we are 70% water as human people in our bodies, and our earth is 70% water. And the question is, how do we relink ourselves to this element within us, but then also in our environment, and how can we live with it as opposed to away from it? And maybe, you know, I mean, the broader question is, do we go back to the sea or do we go to outer space, right?
Yeah. So if I hear you correctly, it seems like, as for now, people have rethought their relationship to the other and learn to reconnect with difference, and somehow following on what you're trying to question in your art by saying, okay, what's the other perspective and what can I learn from it, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, how do we... but I think it's the civilization question is also... if we need to upload ourselves into a non-human form or into outer space, which is going to also... Well, first, this idea of digitization, right? It also is part of it. Well, how do we feed into a matrix of knowledge? Things that we make... I mean, we can feed it data, but how do we feel our humanity into it? How do we upload that? Does that answer my question? So, in order to try to understand who we are as human, that makes us different than robots, right? Or machines, is also trying to understand the other, right?
Yeah.
Like, so obviously we've created systems that turn us into robots. Like, you know, you clock in at work in the morning and you're essentially kind of being a robot until 5 or 6 or 7 p.m. when you're done. And then you go home and you watch TV because you need to blank out. But at the end of the day, the question is, well, what makes us human? And when all of this sort of like work that we've created can be turned into robots, maybe, or mechanized, what do we do with ourselves and our time? For one, if we're alive, and if we're not, and we try to, as a species, transform, what do we take with us if we upload into the metaverse in bits, or if we're gonna need to ship our bodies to outer space? At some point our limbs are not gonna start functioning, so we're gonna need to transform again. And what keeps us who we are in the form that we're gonna take?
Interesting. Let's stay in the field of technology. You said that social media helped a lot.
You shouldn't have asked that question.
I know. I should.
That was a trap.
That was a good answer. Very, very interesting. So you told us that the social media helped mostly local artists to find an audience more easily than maybe before. But I would like to share with you a quote, and I do that at that point of the podcast every time to kind of have like different minds colliding to each other. It's a quote from a book named Far and Away from a psychologist, an art critic, Andrew Solomon, that you may have heard about. It's also a big product of diversity in many ways. And he tells us this: affirming that everyone is of equal importance, legally and morally, is one thing. Saying that everyone has something to say of equal importance is cacophony. You cannot hear 1,000 voices at once and understand what anyone is saying. And somehow, sometimes we can think that too much information, too much content is eventually drowning us and we don't see anything. Can this be a problem for artists, as you have been for centuries, the voice of questioning, the voice of perspective, the voice of people sometimes? And now everyone can say anything and everything. And is art can still find a place in this society where everyone has a voice? Or how can you function yourself as an artist in this new environment of so much content, of equal value of everything?
Well, everybody can answer that question for themselves within their own practice, but I feel like
And if I can add to the question, especially as a Polynesian artist, where we've seen sometimes as very far away from everything and isolated, which that's some perspective of it, but like how can you be heard as an artist also in this cacophony of content?
I think the trap is always to think that as an artist you're successful because people hear what you say right away. Or maybe that's a trap of Western civilization, that this idea of instant gratification, that people are really gonna get it right there, exactly what you said, like you know. And I mean, I'm in my 40s, I'm closer to my 50s, and I feel like it took me all of this time to understand my voice and my perspectives, with an S. And how do I try to, I don't even think anybody, it's hard to find people who get what you're doing right away. It takes time even for other people to decipher what you're doing. And so, for me at least, right? So I feel like I'm not really working for today. It could be selfish, but I'm working for myself in the way I feel like I need to work, because otherwise I'm not going to make the work. But I also feel like hopefully I'm working for the future, right? And for future's people. So I'm not quite sure if that makes sense in the way you're questioning things, because maybe my audience is not born yet.
So it's not about instantaneity, it's about the distance that you will give to people who will see your art even after a long time.
Well, okay, I mean, we have to differentiate between commercial success, critical success, and timeliness of things, right? So you could be making burgers and have a huge commercial success because you're making the same thing and everybody loves it, and they can just like buy it for $20 or 30 or whatever.
It's an expensive burger though.
Well, there are $50 burgers or more. You can put caviar in burgers. But I mean, so the question is always, well, what is the purpose? What is a project? Is a project about sort of like making an image that is instantaneously recognizable and having a brand name so that the market can recognize you and invest in you, because in 50 years maybe then you're going to be dead, and the 100 works that you've made are only going to be those 100 works because you're dead, and they're becoming like an investment because there's no more, and so then they can speculate on your work after you're dead. So I think this is, it's a commercial investment. It's not art necessarily. Right? And so that's that. And then you can think about an art practice as doing something spiritual, that doesn't necessarily have a commercial component, or but that also fulfills you and hopefully fulfills the people who you touch with it, or who interact with it. And then there's also saying things that, sometimes as an artist you have to say things that are not part of the current mood or the political mood. So I've, from early on, I've realized that, for example, the French nuclear military complex with 30 years of nuclear testing in the Pacific was a huge taboo thematic and subject everywhere, like because there was a huge political taboo. You couldn't go into politics talking about it because you were put in prison or jail, and as an artist you couldn't talk about it either because people wouldn't buy it or you wouldn't even get any recognition for anything. But it's like the elephant in the room, and so somebody needed to stand up and say, well, this also shaped us in so many ways and we've never talked about it. And it's the biggest trauma that we've had, and it's shaped us in so many ways that we don't even understand. That if we don't start to talk about it and see it and unpack it, we're going to forget how the keys to these triggers are, and it might actually become bombe à retardement, civilizationally. So I felt that my impetus in trying to think about it that way was, well, it's so big that for someone to not talk about it and think about it visually because we couldn't say it in words, I mean somebody had to do it. So how do I answer that question for you? So when I started doing that work about the nuclear project here, I think a lot of people were not interested here in Polynesia looking at it and seeing it or even buying it. But I had an audience, hopefully in New York, and I did, because it created that space. But I don't think New Yorkers really cared about it either. I mean, it was like, oh, this happened there. We did it in the Marshall Islands too.
Yeah.
But retroactively, maybe in 20 years, when we really digest all of that, and the angers and the hard feelings sort of start to subsume, so that hopefully we can find a solution to go forward and not be stuck with in that moment. We can look at artists who have talked about it and say, well, somebody did it before, and they try to say it right in literature. Or in poetry, or in art, or in songs, and they become mnemonic tools to tell those stories.
Markers in time of like how things were in the society at the time. So I guess it's a
right, and so also in an absence of avec des non-dits, in an absence of words, and in an absence of dialogue or facts. It's like, well, you have to imagine those things, right? You have to fill them in with a sense of the horror, and the horror that is also coupled with the awe. Because, in all of the people I've talked to, they talk about the mushroom cloud as this really amazing, spectacular, beautiful event, right?
And this inability to put words on all this also obviously doesn't help. And art can be the other way to do it.
Hopefully.
Right. My last question for you, Alex. We'll stay there longer, but so for any artist or anyone who's interested in art that who's listening to this episode, who's listening to you and your creative process, if you had anything you'd like to share with them, any idea, anything you'd like to plant in their minds, what would you like to share with them?
I'm thinking you're going to cut the silence, right?
No, it's actually interesting. It's part of the process.
1001, 1002, 1003. I think one should trust in instincts. And be curious about the world, but it's always hard to say like, well, you should do this, right? Because then people can take it the wrong way and say, oh, I really want to just like eat a lot of burgers for the rest of my life and call it art.
Maybe something to remember that is important for you.
Yeah, I think it's trusting one's instincts, but then also not being afraid of getting out of your comfort zone, right? To go and visit the other and try to understand them, or if you're like confronted with something that isn't necessarily pleasurable, to try to question that. Like, why does it not make me feel pleasure, or you know, why does it make me think that it looks ugly? Because for somebody else it might not actually be ugly, or it might not be about the look of it. It might actually be about something else in the process. So like stopping and questioning those for oneself, and then also, you know, asking the other their opinions, maybe I would say it that way.
So looking for anything that questions you or your world or your experience.
Yeah, like being open to the world and the possibilities and yeah, maybe hopefully you know, creating something out of it, as opposed to just wanting it a certain way and wanting in your own way, or like I think surprises are fun, right?
Yeah, they're not always comfortable, but they eventually end up with something
right,
worthy of.
You don't have your arms chopped off because you were bitten by a shark or something.
Let's try to avoid that. All right, Alex, thank you, Maruru, for coming to the Pacific Talks, and all the best of luck for your coming works wherever you'll be in the world.
Thanks for having me. Cheers.
Pacific Talks is a podcast hosted by me, Philipe, and produced by Pacific Venture Media. If you enjoy this conversation, feel free to subscribe on any podcast platform of your choice. You can also share it on your social medias or with your friends, family, or colleagues. And if you listen to it on a podcast platform, feel free to leave us a review. This is very important to us as it helps us to reach out to more people. If you want to share your thoughts and ideas following this conversation, you can reach out to us directly by email, contact@pacificventure.com, or on all our social platforms. Until next time with another guest, another discussion on the challenges of the Pacific. Take care and see you soon.